In 1912, in the mountainous interior of the United States, an entire valley learned, too late, that even silence had rules. Before continuing, just one quick thing, without breaking the mood. Comment below which city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. What we know today does not come from legends, nor from hearsay repeated on porches. It comes from paper, from old ink, from notebooks stored in trunks, from church records, from a sheriff's logbook with yellowed pages, and from 2 letters that crossed the county mail with the same stamp. Ridgeway, October 17th. Ridgeway wasn't exactly a town, it was a fold in the world among tall pine trees. A dirt road that turned to mud with any rain, and a handful of houses clinging to the slope as if afraid of sliding into the valley. There was a sawmill that worked before sunrise, a store where everything smelled of molasses and kerosene, and a wooden bridge over the Bracken River that groaned when a loaded wagon passed over it. In the fall, the fog came early and stayed low, stuck to the ground, making people look like silhouettes. That was where Elijah Mercer lived, 28 years old, with rough hands that knew rope and axe, and a quiet manner described by 3 different witnesses as straight-looking and short of words. Elijah was not a miner. He owned nothing. He was a transport man. He took boards from the sawmill to the farms on the east side, delivered flour, salt, medicine, and sometimes drove outsiders to the nearest station when the road allowed it. Elijah lived with his mother, Ada Mercer, and his younger sister Ruth, who sewed for 2 families and took meticulous notes in a reused school notebook. Their father, Silas Mercer, had died 5 years earlier in a tree fall, an accident common enough to become a short phrase in the archives: trunk collapse, impact to the back of the head. Since then, the Mercer household had been living on the edge of everything: money, breath, calm. And yet, there was routine, and there were small joys. One Sunday a month, Ruth accompanied her mother to the white-painted wooden church. Elijah stayed outside with the other men, listening to the sermon as if listening to rain behind a window. At the store, he always paid the exact amount and never argued about the price. The mule, Old Ben, was almost a member of the family, which is why details about him appear repeatedly in the accounts as if the animal were proof of reality. Very docile, gray, limping slightly on his hind leg. But Ridgeway also had a second routine, harder and quieter, that of absences. Between 1906 and 1912, at least 4 names appear in county records as not located after leaving for the same destination, the rocky ridge called on maps Hartsfield Ridge. In the village, no one used the name on the map. They just called it the Ridge. It was a narrow strip of high ground with loose rocks and sparse vegetation separating Ridgeway from a group of isolated farms on the other side. The shortest route was via an old trail, forcibly opened during the timber boom and maintained since then more out of insistence than safety. There was a rule, repeated without humor, as if it were part of the local alphabet. After the 6 o'clock whistle from the sawmill, no one crosses the ridge. Not on foot, not by mule, not even for just a short stretch. And if the fog rolls in, no one crosses at any time. The rule did not come from irrational fear. It came from facts. Sudden landslides, sections where the rock gave way under weight, and the constant presence of men who did not want to be seen. Liquor smugglers, fugitives, armed people who preferred that strangers not return to tell the tale. When someone asked why it was so serious, the answer was always the same: short, tired, because it has happened before. The problem is that over time, the rule became noise. A warning repeated so many times that it lost its power. Some followed it, others pretended to follow it, and there were those who believed that prudence was an old man's thing. In the archives, Elijah appears for the first time not as missing, but as a witness. In 1911, he signed, in firm, unadorned handwriting, a statement about a wagon found empty near the start of the Ridge Trail. The owner of the wagon, a man named Calvin Sorrell, was never seen again. Elijah described the scene with a detail that stands out precisely because it is so simple. The harness was cut, not broken. This kind of detail is what makes a case survive for decades. It's not the drama. It's the small precision that doesn't fit with chance. The following fall, 1912, Ridgeway was more tense than usual. The sawmill had picked up the pace to take advantage of the dry season. The road to the station was always full of wagons. At the same time, there were reports of an armed man seen near the river and a group of strangers camped on the north side, where families avoided passing. It was in this climate, too much work, too much fear, too little conversation, that the name Elijah Mercer appears in the sheriff's book for the last time. The entry is short, almost bureaucratic. Date: October 17th, 1912. Time: shortly after 6 p.m. Text: Mercer E. left to deliver medicine to the Klein farm, promised to return before dark. Anyone reading this today feels the weight of a cruel irony. Delivering medicine, returning before dark. And just below, as if it were a hastily added note, there is a sentence written in another ink. Darker, less careful handwriting. Probably by the sheriff himself. The rule was remembered. He said it would be quick. But there is a strange detail in the files, one that time cannot explain and paper cannot forgive. The next page, where the rest of the account of that night should be, has been violently torn out. It is not torn. It has been ripped out, leaving an irregular edge in the middle of the book, like a fingernail scraping across it. And on the bottom margin of the previous page, almost hidden by a stain of coffee or dried mud, someone wrote in pencil a single word that appears in no other county record: Barranco. Ridgeway had a particular way of measuring time. It wasn't by the calendar, nor by the clock in the store. It was by sound. The whistle of the sawmill at dawn, the whistle at 6 in the evening, the hammer on the horseshoe twice a week, the church bell on Sundays. And when autumn came, there was another marker, the dry crackling of leaves under his boots, as if each step reminded him that the ground was more fragile than it seemed. The Mercers lived in a low, dark planked house with a narrow porch and a window that was never completely clean on the inside, not because of neglect, but because of the fine dust that the road kicked up. Ada Mercer was a woman in her early 50s, her back bent before her time, her hands with small cracks that never healed in the cold. She did not complain in public. Those who knew her said that Ada had a habit of swallowing her worries as if they were lukewarm water, quickly, tastelessly, without pause. Ruth, her daughter, carried another form of silence. She was young, but already had the look of someone who observes more than she speaks. In her school notebook, she wrote down expenses: soap, flour, kerosene, thread, salt. She also wrote down things no one asked for: north wind, short rain, early fog, as if recording the environment was a way of not getting lost in it. Elijah was the backbone of that small family. He was not a man of grand gestures. In Ridgeway, that counted. The reports about him have no excessive adjectives. They have observations. Punctual, knows how to handle mules, doesn't drink at the store, doesn't buy on credit. There is a phrase repeated by two neighbors in separate statements years later. He looked at people as if he were weighing them. It wasn't coldness. It was caution, almost a profession. His work varied. Sometimes the sawmill needed someone to take boards to a distant farm and return with a signed receipt. Other times, the store hired him to deliver a bag of sugar or a package of nails. And then there were the tasks that weren't on any piece of paper, delivering messages from one place to another, accompanying a traveler to the main road, guiding a doctor on difficult nights. Elijah knew the shortcuts and he knew the risks. The ridge, Hartsfield Ridge, was one of those risks that he treated as law. He knew the rule. Everyone knew it. And as far as the records show, he respected it. In 1910, for example, a letter from a county merchant mentions that Mercer refused to cross after the whistle, even though he was offered double pay. That line appears because the merchant was complaining about the delay. But, unwittingly, he proves something. Elijah was not reckless. He was not a just one more minute kind of man. So what changed in 1912? The documents suggest an answer that does not seem dramatic, but that is exactly how life often turns out of simple necessity. In the first half of October, there was a string of dry, cold days. The sawmill sped up, the dust increased, and the air became harsh, smelling of resin and freshly cut wood. The community was tired of work, of rumors, and of a vague feeling that there were too many people hanging around the river. During this same period, the name Klein began to appear more frequently in reports. The Klein farm was on the other side of the ridge, in a low-lying area where the late afternoon light was different, paler, more slanted. The Kleins were known for being reserved, but respected. They were not wealthy. They were persistent. They had 2 small children and a sick man, Walter Klein, who had been suffering from chest pains since the summer. The nearest doctor came by horse-drawn carriage when he could, and when he couldn't, he sent medicine with someone he trusted. The week before the disappearance, Ada Mercer was seen at church asking for something rare, help. She didn't ask for money. She asked for prayers for Ruth. There is no explanation in the congregation's records, but in Mrs. Lottie Graves's testimony taken years later, she says, Ruth was pale, coughing, and had a low fever, and Ada seemed afraid to sleep. Fever was not a light word in those days. It could have been just a cold. It could have been something worse. And that possibility changes the way a man decides to cross a ridge. Elijah in those days was described as even quieter. A store clerk, Thomas Pike, said he bought extra kerosene and matches, and that to Ridgeway was a sign of long nights. Ruth wrote in her notebook, in a line that was almost faded, Mother did not sleep. Just below, wind shifted, early fog. There were also signs outside. A neighbor, Ezra Mott, reported seeing a group of men without animals walking fast near the Bracken River on a Tuesday evening, heading north. They were not locals. He described the sound of their boots, heavy in step, as if they were used to walking together. Ezra did not follow them. In Ridgeway, curiosity could be a death sentence. These small signs, fever at home, extra kerosene, strangers on the road, fog coming in early, form a kind of involuntary preamble. No one, at that moment, put it all together. People lived one day at a time. Fear, when it is constant, becomes part of the scenery, like the damp wood of the porch. On the afternoon of October 17th, Ruth woke up feeling better. At least that's what Ada told the sheriff in a brief statement. She said the fever seemed to have subsided, and that may have created a dangerous feeling, relief. When someone feels relieved, they let their guard down. And when their guard is down, the rule that has always been the rule may seem like an exaggeration. It was also on that day that a small shipment of medicine arrived at the warehouse. Among them, a bottle intended for the Kleins. The store owner noted that it needed to be delivered by the next morning. Nothing urgent on paper, but off the paper there was reality. Walter Klein was worse, and according to a note later found among the doctor's belongings, if he doesn't take it by tonight, he may not survive another crisis. Elijah was sought out because he was reliable, because he knew the way, because he knew how to handle the trail, and because he had something at stake. In small communities, delivering medicine was not a favor. It was a silent pact of survival. The problem was that the 6 o'clock whistle didn't expect any pact. A statement by Thomas Pike himself describes Elijah in the warehouse late in the afternoon. He reportedly looked up at the sky, as if measuring its color, and then at the ground, as if sensing the humidity by its smell. Pike says he commented, "It's going to fog up," and Elijah simply replied, "I know." The same witness states that before leaving, Elijah did something unusual. He put a small key and a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket. It wasn't money. It wasn't a receipt. It was something personal, the kind of gesture that, in retrospect, always seems like a farewell, but at the time may have been just prudence. Ada, according to the records, tried to stop him, not with a scream, with a short phrase. The phrase that appears in 2 different statements, almost identical, is, "Not today." Elijah would have stood still for a few seconds on the porch, listening to the distant whistle of the sawmill, that long, final sound, and then replied, "It's just a round trip." In the last confirmed description, Ruth saw him carefully adjust old Ben's harness. tightening it twice as if testing it. The sun had already set behind the trees, but there was still enough light to see the path. The road looked ordinary. That is the cruelest detail. Nothing looked like a scene from a tragedy. Everything looked like a normal day. He left with the bottle wrapped up, the thin blanket on top, the mule following meekly. The ridge trail began after the bridge, where the wood creaked. A boy, who was later heard by the sheriff, said that Elijah nodded, without smiling as he always did, and then the valley swallowed the sound of his footsteps. The last indirect record of that afternoon comes from a strange place, the store's account book. In the margin of a payment line, the owner wrote, "Mercer, if fog, won't be back today." It is unclear whether this was concern, habit, or a simple note to justify a delay. But when darkness finally fell, and the fog descended like a wet cloth, Ada Mercer sat by the window with a lamp lit. And according to Mrs. Lottie Graves, she repeated the same phrase softly, as if it were both a prayer and a threat. "He knows the rule. He knows the rule." Except that the rule on that night was no longer a general warning. It was an invisible countdown. And the tiny detail that closes this section, small but disturbing, is this. Among the papers found years later in the Mercer home, there was a draft of a letter from Ruth, never sent, with an incomplete sentence in the middle. "If he crosses the ravine, tell him." The sentence ends there, and the rest of the page is blank. What can be reconstructed from that night is not a perfect sequence. It is a mosaic. Pieces of schedules written down by simple people, memories that have faded, mud marks described by eyes trained on cattle, and a single fact that runs through all the accounts. The fog descended too early. On the afternoon of October 17th, 1912, the sky was the color of tin. It wasn't raining, but the air felt heavy, as if it were holding water without letting it go. The light at the end of the day passed through the trees in slanted strips, and when Elijah Mercer crossed the Bracken River bridge, the creaking of the wood was heard by two men who were on the opposite side, fixing a fence. One of them, Amos Dyer, swore to the sheriff years later that the creak was longer than usual, as if the bridge had responded to the weight with weariness. Elijah walked with old Ben at a steady pace, with no apparent hurry. He knew the way to the start of the ridge trail. There was a stone marker where, they said, the road changed hands. From there on up, it was no longer farmland or city land. It was no man's land. Amos Dyer said he saw Elijah stop at that marker. Not for long, just long enough to look at the trees and the ground as if checking something. Then he continued on. This short pause is important because, next to the marker, there was a fallen log with old knife marks. Signs of people who, for years, had left small messages carved into the wood. Almost all of them had been erased. But that night, according to what was found days later, there was a new scratch. A short arrow, and an almost illegible word. The sheriff wrote it down as best he could. "Come back." No one knows who wrote it, no one knows when. All we know is that it was there. The climb up the ridge was not a dramatic one. It was a continuous, stubborn effort, with loose stones underfoot and breath becoming shorter. Old Ben, even though docile, had a habit of slowing down in certain stretches, an old instinct. Elijah knew this and did not push him too hard. The trail skirted a low wall and entered a corridor of thinner trees, where the wind passed with a hollow sound. The first evidence that something was different appears in a simple statement: the sound. A boy named Henry Puckett, who lived in a tall house on the east side, said that at dusk he heard a long crack coming from the direction of the ridge, as if a tree trunk had broken. But it was not the sound of a whole tree falling. It was a single dry crack, followed by silence. The boy was 15 years old. He didn't invent anything supernatural. He described it as he would compare it to anything he knew. It sounded like wood breaking, or an old door slamming. At about the same time, a woman on the other side of the valley, Mabel Klein, Walter's wife, claimed to have seen in the distance a dark spot moving on the trail, with a remnant of light. She believed it was Elijah because she was waiting for him. She didn't hear anything. She only saw the movement, and then it disappeared behind the trees. From here on, time begins to narrow. The fog began to rise from the river like cold smoke. In Ridgeway this was not uncommon, but that night it rose quickly, as if someone had spilled milk on the ground, the sheriff himself later wrote in a personal letter. The kind of fog that erases distance. You see the fence and you don't see the house. You see your hand and you don't see the tip of your arm. On the way to the ridge there was a stretch known to the locals, the ravine. It wasn't a movie-like abyss. It was a narrow curve where the trail ran close to a short, uneven drop full of loose rocks and exposed roots. A place that, during the day, demanded attention. At night, it demanded stubbornness. Some avoided it, others crossed quickly without stopping, as if fear itself were pushing them. This is where the reconstruction takes its first concrete blow. Old Ben returned alone. The church clock struck shortly after 8 when the mule appeared at the beginning of the main road, descending toward the village. The first to see it was Thomas Pike, the store owner, closing the door. He reported that old Ben was coming with his head down and his harness too loose, as if someone had tried to adjust it and given up. And the strangest detail, the animal was wet on one side only, as if it had touched something damp, or slipped down a stretch of the ravine and scraped itself on the ground. Pike ran to it. He called for Elijah. There was no answer. The fog swallowed sound like thick cloth. The only thing he could hear, he said, was the animal's breathing and a faint sound of leather hitting its chest. Inside the blanket covering the load, the medicine bottle was gone. It wasn't broken. It wasn't hidden. It was simply gone. And there was a mark on the harness, a clean shortcut on the side, exactly the kind of cut Elijah described in 1911 in the Calvin Sorrell case. Not broken, cut. The news spread quickly but without shouting. People in small towns don't react like they do in cities. They react by gathering men, grabbing lanterns, and going out in silence. The sheriff, Harlan Voss, was called. He wrote in the book, "Mua returned without a man." That phrase appears as a sentence. No embellishment. Just that. They organized an immediate search, but did not go up the ridge that night. That decision is the kind of thing that seems cowardly on paper, until you remember the rule, until you imagine fog covering loose rocks and the possibility of losing more people. Even so, 3 men were stubborn. Amos Dyer, Ezra Mott, and Pike himself decided to go to the bridge and look at the beginning of the trail, at least. They took kerosene lanterns, which created faint circles of yellow light. The rest was shadow. At the bridge, the Bracken River was higher than usual, not because of rain, but because of a cold current, according to the elders. The water hit the rocks with a continuous sound, muffled by the fog. And there, near the first stretch of the climb, they found something that changed the night from delay to disappearance. A glove. It wasn't an elegant glove. It was a work glove, thick, with reinforced stitching. Ada Mercer recognized it the next day, but Pike recognized it right away. He had seen Elijah wearing that glove while carrying boards. The glove was on the ground as if it had been dropped, and next to it was a short mark in the mud like a drag. Ezra Mott described what he saw with a phrase that has gone down in history. It looked like someone had been pulled aside. They called the sheriff, but the sheriff wouldn't let anyone go up. Not that night. He ordered them to mark the spot with a stake and come back. However, on his return, Pike did something he never told the sheriff at the time. It only appears in a later statement, when there was no longer any hope. He took a few steps beyond what was allowed, following the mark in the mud to where the trail narrowed. And there, at the edge of the tree corridor, he saw what he described as a low glow, almost on the ground. He lowered his flashlight and found a small metallic object with worn edges. It was a key, not just any key, a short house key with an old tip, which Ada kept on a ribbon inside a drawer. The key to the trunk, where Ruth kept her notebooks. How did that key end up on the trail? That question is what turns the night into a knot, because a house key doesn't go to a medicine delivery. It doesn't go to a quick crossing. The key suggests intention, fear, or preparation. It also suggests that someone rummaged through Elijah's pockets, or that Elijah rummaged through his own pockets in a moment of tension. The sheriff picked up the glove. Pike hid the key and said nothing. He put it in his pocket as if he were keeping a secret too heavy to share in the fog. The group returned to Ridgeway in silence. Ada waited at the window with the lamp lit. Ruth stood behind her, covered in a shawl, her face pale. When they saw the mule without Elijah, no one screamed. Ada just leaned her hand against the wood of the window, as if she needed to lean on the world to keep from falling. At dawn, the fog became so dense that the light from the lamp seemed to float inside a glass of milk. And, according to Ruth's testimony, there is a moment she has never forgotten. She heard from outside a short sound, like metal hitting stone, once, and then nothing. The clock did not register this sound. Only she did. Dawn came pale and cold, and the search began in earnest. But the climax of the disappearance had already happened. Elijah Mercer had vanished between the 6 o'clock whistle and old Ben's lonely return. And then comes the last confirmed piece of evidence, the one that ends this section like a knife left on the table. When the sheriff's team finally climbed up the ravine, they found a fresh scratch on the damp rock, a few feet from the narrow bend, as if someone had dragged something hard there. And, caught in an exposed root, was a strip of dark cloth, torn, about 2 fingers wide. It wasn't from Elijah's clothes. It was the kind of fabric used in a traveler's coat. And just above, on the trunk of a pine tree, someone had made 3 vertical marks with a blade, fresh enough to still show the light wood beneath the bark. 3 marks. A trail marker, a warning, a count. The sheriff wrote down just 1 sentence, short, almost as if he didn't want to write any more. It wasn't a fall. It was done. The next morning brought no clarity. It brought a harsher cold, the kind that dries the clay on top and leaves the mud alive underneath. The fog slowly receded from the valley, as if being pulled by invisible hands, but what it left behind was not light. It was a scene that seemed too normal for a disappearance of that magnitude. Sheriff Harlan Voss organized the search, as one would organize a funeral before death, methodically and with few words. He divided the men into pairs, wrote down names, handed out flashlights, and ordered no one to stray from the main trail. "Don't lose 2 for 1, he reportedly said. It was the rule behind the rule. The first steps of the climb already revealed something disturbing. The trail was not disturbed, as it would have been if a man and a mule had passed by there in a struggle. There was no sign of scattered desperation. There were only isolated marks, as if the event had been brief, controlled, and worse, planned. At the point where the glove had been found, the mud held mixed footprints, but there weren't as many as one would expect. The sheriff's men, accustomed to following the tracks of cattle and people, said the marks seemed interrupted, as if someone had left the trail and entered the woods in a stretch where it was not easy to leave without leaving a signature on the ground. When they reached the ravine, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of the woods. It was the silence of a place that knows. There, the sheriff ordered everyone to stop and look. He himself climbed down a short distance, holding onto roots, and returned with his hands dirty with dark earth. He said a single sentence. There was weight here, and then came the first material clue that no one wanted to find. Bloodstains. Not a pool, not a massacre scene. Just small, dry stains on the lowest rock in the ravine, as if a wound had touched it for a second. That changed the tone of the search. The disappearance was no longer "someone got lost." It became "someone was hurt." The community reacted the way communities react when something threatens the invisible pact that keeps everyone going. With solidarity and with suspicion. Women took turns bringing food to the Mercers. The pastor went to the house, sat with Ada, and read passages from the Bible like someone trying to cover a hole with a cloth. Men volunteered to patrol the road at night, but at the same time, the whispered questions that no one would ask aloud began. Why did he take the key? Why did he cross after the whistle? Who else knew he was going? And there was the name that hung over all the others like a shadow. Calvin Sorrell, the missing man from the previous year. The man whose wagon was found with the harness cut. The similarities were too obvious to be a coincidence. For some, it was proof. For others, it was an old sentence coming back to haunt them. Sheriff Voss, in the early days, avoided talking about criminals. He spoke of dangerous trails and treacherous fog, as if still trying to hold on to reality with less violent words. But behind the scenes, he opened a separate notebook, one that was not visible in his office. In it, he wrote down the names of people seen near the river, strange hours, and reports of gunshots heard in the distance. The rumors began to organize themselves into 3 lines of thought. The first said that Elijah had been attacked by smugglers. The region had illegal alcohol circulation and hidden trade. A man with a mule and cargo could have been mistaken for a threat. But that didn't explain the key, nor the harness cut so specifically. The second line was worse. It said that someone from Ridgeway was involved, not out of gratuitous malice, but for money, for debt, for fear, those common things that make ordinary people cross boundaries. And the third, the quietest, said something almost unthinkable for that family, that Elijah might have gone to meet someone and not just to deliver medicine, that the delivery was a pretext, that the real reason was not on paper. It was in this atmosphere that a statement changed everything. It didn't come from the woods. It came from the warehouse. Thomas Pike, the warehouse owner, held out for 2 days. Then, on the 3rd night, he showed up at the sheriff's office with a downcast face, the smell of kerosene on his clothes, and the eyes of someone who hadn't slept. He asked to speak alone. The sheriff closed the door, and Pike placed a small metal object on the table. The key. He admitted to finding it on the night of the disappearance and hiding it for fear of becoming the target of questions. He said he didn't know why Elijah was carrying it. He said he thought it was none of his business. And as he said it, he himself realized the weakness of the phrase. Because in Ridgeway, everything was everyone's business when someone disappeared. The sheriff was silent for a long time, long enough for Pike to hear his own heartbeat. Then he asked, "Did you see anything else?" Pike hesitated, and then, as if pulling a splinter from inside himself, he told him about the glint he saw on the trail and the 3 marks on the pine tree. The sheriff wrote everything down. The next day, Voss went to the Mercer house with the key. Ada recognized it. So did Ruth. But when Ruth saw the key, she didn't cry. She stiffened. And then, in a low voice, she said something no one expected. He took it. The sheriff asked her to explain. Ada began to say that Elijah must have taken it by mistake, but Ruth interrupted. And there, for the first time, the human revelation that changes the case appears, not as a definitive solution, but as the emotional truth behind the facts. Ruth said that the week before, Calvin Sorrell's father had stopped by their house, not to accuse, to beg. He said he believed someone knew what had happened to his son, and that if Elijah helped find out, he would pay. Ruth said she heard the man say a name she did not clearly repeat in her official statement. But the sheriff wrote it down as best he could, with doubt. Ruth then confessed that Elijah had been collecting clippings and notes about the disappearances, not out of curiosity, but because he had seen the cut harness in 1911 and couldn't get it out of his head. More importantly, she said Elijah believed there was a specific spot on the ridge where the disappearances repeated themselves. The ravine. Always the ravine. Always that curve. And then comes the phrase that gives the key another meaning. Elijah had decided that night not only to deliver the medicine, but to leave something stored on the other side, at the Klein farm, in case he didn't return. A notebook. A piece of paper. Evidence. Something he didn't want to leave at home. Vulnerable. That's why he took the key to the trunk. He opened the trunk before leaving and took out an envelope. Ruth didn't see the contents. She only saw the gesture. And when she tried to ask, he replied with the same phrase he repeated to his mother. "It's just a round trip." The medicine was real, but there was another mission hidden inside his coat. This explains why the bottle disappeared without breaking. The bottle could have been delivered or taken by someone as a way to throw off the trail. It explains why he took the key. It even explains why he stopped at the stone marker. He wasn't just passing by. He was alert, looking for signs, looking for patterns. The sheriff, with that, changed his approach. He stopped looking for a lost man and started looking for a man who found out too much. On the Klein side, the story had its own pain. Mabel Klein confirmed that the medicine never arrived. She confirmed that she did not see Elijah at the door. And she confirmed something she had not said before because she was afraid. That night, she heard from outside two male voices arguing on the road for a few seconds, and then a sharp sound, like leather snapping or a body falling on stone. She did not open the door. She had 2 children and a sick husband. She stood motionless, holding the latch, and then heard footsteps receding. 2 days after the disappearance, the cruelest and most plausible trace of all appeared. A cloth handkerchief found near the Bracken River, caught in low branches with embroidered initials. E.M. Ada recognized it as Elijah's. The fabric was damp and smelled of iron, a faint smell of old blood. The river at that point ran deep. The sheriff noted, "Body may have been taken." But Ridgeway had no body. There was no burial. There was no end. The community began to divide. Some blamed the smugglers. Others blamed the sheriff for not going up on the first night. Others, silently, blamed Elijah for breaking the rule. Because blaming the missing person is a way of thinking that the world still obeys logic. But there was one detail that kept everyone awake: the 3 marks on the pine tree. On the 6th night, a group of men decided to return to the ridge later against the sheriff's orders. They wanted to see if anyone was lurking around. They went with guns and flashlights. They came back with nothing except for a new sign. On the same pine tree where there were 3 marks, a 4th appeared, fresh, clear, as if someone had returned to the scene just to say, "I know you're watching." Sheriff Voss wrote, at the bottom of the page of the separate notebook, a sentence that was not for the public. "This is no accident. It's a warning." And the emotional revelation, the one that hits the family like a slow knife, comes in a letter Ada received 2 weeks later, with no return address. Plain paper, crude handwriting, a single line: "Stop meddling in what isn't yours, or the house will be empty too." Nothing supernatural, just a human threat, direct, plausible, and devastating. Ada didn't tell the church, she didn't tell her neighbors, she only showed it to the sheriff. And at that moment, the case was no longer just about Elijah Mercer. It became about Ruth, about Ada, about who would be left if the valley decided to swallow another name. This block ends with the most dangerous mini cliffhanger of all, because it is silent and intimate. On the same night the letter arrived, Ruth opened the trunk with the returned key, rummaged through her father's papers, old notebooks, accounts, and found, hidden under a loose board at the bottom, an empty envelope with a pencil note inside. "If I don't come back, look where the mule returned alone." And below, as if it were the last thing written in haste, the rule wasn't about fog. It was about people. Decades later, Ridgeway hardly existed as it did in 1912. The sawmill closed in the 1930s. The Bracken River Bridge was replaced by another, more solid one, and then by a concrete passageway without history. The dirt road became a narrow strip of asphalt, and maps began to call the valley by a name that carries no fear. The old people died. The new ones grew up without knowing the weight of the 6 o'clock whistle. But some cases don't die with people. They just change boxes. Elijah Mercer's disappearance remained in county records as unsolved, with marginal notes made by different hands over time. Possible fall, possible homicide, body not found. In 1958, someone added, "related to other disappearances on the ridge." In 1974, another hand wrote, "insufficient evidence." These are stamps that seem definitive, but to those who read them, they sound like an official surrender. What is known for certain is little. Elijah left home in the late afternoon of October 17, 1912. The mule returned alone. A glove was found on the trail. A handkerchief appeared near the river. There were bloodstains in the ravine. There were knife marks on the pine tree. And there was a letter with no return address telling the family to stop digging. The rest is silence filled with hypotheses, and hypotheses filled with fear. In the years that followed, Sheriff Harlan Voss kept trying, but life brought new cases, and the county had neither the resources nor the political will nor the technology. The search became intermittent, almost ritualistic. Every time someone disappeared or was injured on the ridge, someone remembered the name Mercer and said, "It was just like that time." The disappearance became a reference point. It became a unit of measurement for danger. Voss kept the separate notebook until he retired. Then the notebook ended up in file boxes, along with letters and ammunition receipts. Many papers were lost. Others remained by chance because no one had time to burn them. When, years later, a local researcher gathered the documents to put together a dossier, the kind of work that only a stubborn person would do, he found a series of testimonies that, together, do not prove guilt, but paint a human picture. First, the disappearances on the ridge were not random. The repetition of the ravine, the cut harness, the absence of scattered struggle, everything pointed to quick, conscious action by someone who knew the terrain. Second, there was a reason why the 6 o'clock whistle rule was stronger than any advice. It wasn't about the fog itself, it was about the fog as cover, about the time when the valley lost its witnesses, about the moment when a person could be removed from the world without leaving more than an object on the ground. Third, the written threat to the Mercer family shows something essential. Someone felt watched. Someone understood that Elijah was not just a delivery man, but a man who was putting pieces together. And when a man puts pieces together in a small place, he messes with invisible agreements. What happened to Ada and Ruth is no less important than what happened to Elijah. Ada, according to church records, aged quickly. She stopped attending services regularly. She began to avoid the window at night. A neighbor wrote in a letter that she didn't want the light on after dark, as if the light was calling. She died in 1921 of pneumonia, without seeing her son again, and without a grave to place flowers on for him. Ruth, on the other hand, did what many people cannot do when the world demands silence. She left. In 1914, 2 years after her disappearance, the name Ruth Mercer appears in an employment record in another city, almost 100 miles away, working as a seamstress. Then the name disappears, not because she disappeared, but because she chose to disappear from the valley. This is also a form of survival, leaving before the place finishes the job. There is only one document linking Ruth to the case after that, a letter sent to the county office in 1939. Thin paper, firmer, more adult handwriting. She doesn't sign with her last name. She signs only R. The letter doesn't ask for the case to be reopened. It does not accuse anyone. It only asks if the ridge still swallows men, and if someone finally spoke up. The county responded formally. It said there was no news. The researcher who gathered the papers found this letter folded inside the same envelope as a newspaper clipping from 1912. In the clipping, a quote from Sheriff Voss is cited, a short, almost bitter sentence. "When a man disappears here, it's not like in the city. Here, the bush helps." But what weighs most heavily in the Mercer case is not what the bush helped to hide. It is what the community helped to tolerate. Because when reading the statements, it is impossible to ignore the small signs of collective fear. People who saw and did not speak up. People who heard and locked their doors. People who preferred the rule to the search. People who blamed the missing man so they would not have to look the other way. Elijah Mercer's disappearance seems today like the kind of story someone would try to turn into a myth. But the paper prevents it. The paper insists there was no ghost, no curse, no supernatural shadow. There were people, there was interest, there was cowardice, and there was a valley where silence was safer than the truth. The closest thing to an answer appears in a forgotten note written in pencil in Sheriff Voss's separate notebook, undated. The researcher found it at the bottom of a box, smelling of mold and old smoke. The sentence is simple, but it carries the weary hand of someone who gave up on arresting someone and decided to at least record it for himself. "I found no body. I found consent." It's hard to explain this to someone who has never lived in a small, isolated community. Sometimes crimes are not sustained by weapons or force alone. They are sustained by convenience, by fear, by people who would rather keep life functioning than open a wound that could swallow everyone up. The 6 o'clock whistle rule didn't exist just to save travelers. It existed to maintain a pact. Don't provoke what was on the other side, and yet someone always provokes. Because someone always believes they can cross quickly, that they can break the rule once. that they can look closely without paying for it. In 1962, a new sheriff tried to reopen the case along with other disappearances in the region. He conducted interviews, cross-referenced names, visited the ravine, photographed the pine tree. He found nothing that could put handcuffs on anyone, but he found the same look in the eyes of the old residents. The look of those who had decided decades ago what could and could not be said. The pine tree with the marks still existed at that time, according to a photograph attached to the dossier. The bark had old scars. The vertical marks had grown along with the tree, becoming part of it. A warning that had aged and become natural, and perhaps that is the final image most faithful to the Mercer case. Violence becoming landscape, threat becoming tradition, fear becoming the rule. Today, those who cross that ridge find a more open trail, less dense forest, modern signs, and no visible reminder of the ravine. But there are places that do not need visible reminders. They continue to repeat the same question in silence. How many people disappeared before anyone had the courage to call it by its name? The researcher who reconstructed the case wrote at the end of the report, a reflection that does not seem to come from a historian, but from someone tired of archives and yet unable to close the file. He wrote that deep down, Elijah Mercer was not just another missing person. He was an ordinary man who tried to understand a pattern and, in trying to understand, touched on a part of the world that many people prefer to leave untouched. There is a particular tragedy in this. Elijah did not break the rule out of arrogance. He broke it out of necessity and a sense of justice. He broke it because someone needed medicine, and because he believed that if he didn't look, no one else would. He broke it as many break it, believing that the right thing, done quickly and quietly, would not attract the worst. But the worst in places like this doesn't need to be attracted. It's already there. It just waits for the right moment. And the last sentence of this case, the one that whenever you read it leaves your mouth dry and the room colder, is not in a newspaper, nor in a sermon. It is on the back of the empty envelope that Ruth found in the trunk years later, kept as if it were a paper will. A single sentence, written in faint pencil, almost erased, as if the author knew that time would try to kill that too. The last rule they ignored was not to come back alive. It was not to find out who didn't want to be seen.